My name is Aaron Clark-Rizzio. I'm the Executive Director of the Louisiana Center for Children's Rights, and I want to thank you all for being here today. I want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule for this important conversation and to be a part of this second segment of the Campaign for Children's Rights. This is a new event for LCCR, one we've embarked on this year due to the COVID restrictions. In lieu of an in-person event, we have shifted to doing a series of panel discussions focusing on the issues that are most important to us. You often in the past have heard from LCCR talking about often the problems that we see in our criminal legal system, especially as it pertains to young people. In this series, we really wanted to focus on not only the current problems, but the solutions. And so that's why we're so happy that you joined us tonight. As I said, this is the second in a series. Last week, we discussed ending the criminalization of Black youth. We wanted to ground this discussion in of our juvenile justice system, with the fact that it's defined so much right now by race and racism. And then in today's discussion and next week's discussion, we really wanted to start focusing on the mindsets and tactics and strategies that we think are the way forward to support all youth and to promote better outcomes for all of us in the community. So I want to thank, we have friends in the field here this evening. We have some of our funding partners on the line. And then we just have incredible supporters who have been with us for a long time and who want to be a part of this discussion. So today we're talking about building kids up, not breaking them down, how we can focus on positive youth development as a way of engaging and intervening with children. We have an unbelievable set of talent here this evening. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to the moderator, Sarah Omojola.
Hi, everyone. I'm really honored to be here, and I'm really excited to speak with our panelists. I am Sarah Omojola. I'm the Associate Director of Vera Institute of Justice in New Orleans. We focus on criminal legal system reform. I am a native New Orleanian. I taught in New Orleans public schools, and I started my legal career working with youth and educators and continue to do so throughout my career. And I'm really honored again to be here. And we have a group of very knowledgeable experts who will each introduce themselves briefly before we get started. So I will turn it over to Heather to go first with your introduction.
Hi, good evening. Thanks to everyone for joining us. My name is Heather Kindschy. I'm a social worker by training. I came to Louisiana Center for Children's Rights in 2012 after being a school social worker for several years and being very frustrated by seeing many kids that I really cared about caught up in the system. And this idea of positive youth development is really near and dear to my heart. In 2013, I took a trip to the Public Defender Office, CPCS in Boston, and they kind of told us all that they knew about positive youth development and kind of gave me a really good framework for coming back and trying to build the program as it exists today. And so it's the framework that we use, it's the thing that we try to go back to, and I'm really excited to talk about it tonight.
All right, Darrin, let's hear from you next.
Sure. So my name is Darrin McCall. Thanks again for having me, LCCR and team, to talk about the topic this evening. But I'm the Chief Program Officer at the Youth Empowerment Project here in New Orleans. And so I've been with YEP, as we call ourselves, since around 2009. So I came here, I'm also a social worker by training, but came here to get my master's in social work from Tulane University, and applied for a job at YEP, and they said, well, why don't you just do an internship for free? And so I worked as an unpaid intern for about a year, but that's really where I got my introduction, I think, to the juvenile justice system here in New Orleans, because I worked in YEP's community reintegration program with young people returning from secure facilities back to the New Orleans area. So that was my first experience with young people here in New Orleans. And so I was hired on after that point in time and have worked in many of our different programs working with, system involved and underserved young people across the region, really. And so in my current role, I oversee our mentoring programs that work directly with system-involved young people receiving referrals from the Office of Juvenile Justice, Orleans Parish Juvenile Court, and the DA's office. And then I also oversee our community-based enrichment programming. So we do after-school programs, summer camps, and a sleepaway camp for young people impacted by substance abuse.
Awesome. And then I see you're already getting shout outs in the chat, Darrin. So to round us out, Dr. Jeffrey Butts.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be with you. And to continue the theme, I'm also a social worker. At least I started out that way. I meant to stay in my field of child welfare where I started, but I became, I've also heard the word frustrated already. I became frustrated by my colleagues in the agency I was working in, their disregard for evidence. So I decided to get a PhD, still thinking I'd stay in child welfare. And then my first research project at the University of Michigan was with the Casey Foundation. I met this guy named Bart, who got me intrigued into the world of youth justice and doing research on youth justice, where I've spent the past 30 years. And the field of youth development is perfectly suited to be the foundational practice for justice-involved young people. And it's still hard to make that happen for a number of reasons, which we can go into. Part of it's the difficulty of generating solid evidence, and part of it is that people who work in the system see that justice-involved young people as somehow a different breed of young people who need to have all their problems fixed instead of just being supported and built up. So I think it's a very important conversation. It's somewhat frustrating that we're still having this conversation decades into the awareness of this issue. But I'm glad you're all here, and I'm looking forward to participating.
Yeah, so I am super excited that this is a panel of social workers because I usually hang out with a lot of lawyers, and that is always okay. So so let's get into it. So, we're talking about building kids up and not tearing them down. And so we're going to start this discussion about where are we here in New Orleans in terms of how children are treated in the justice system, and how well are we building them up versus tearing them down? And so, Heather, if you would go ahead and go first and tell us where we are.
Sure. So I think there's a kind of a lot going on because there's a lot of different players that are involved in trying to intervene when kids come into the justice system. But I do think that we are stuck in this mindset, as Dr. Butts just said, of trying to fix all the problems with kids because it seems to be an easier thing to do one thing for a kid than to solve like an entire community-wide problem, like poverty or like not having enough community resources for kids, which I think we know to be true. And so that's what people tend to focus on. And so I think in New Orleans, what tends to happen is that there are people with intentions that are good oftentimes that are trying to help, like they think that what they're doing is helping, and what it ends up doing is just it becomes too much. They're trying to over program for kids, getting them involved with things that they don't necessarily need. They're over pathologizing kids. Anyone who's worked in schools knows that there are very many kids that have these labels of mental illness and like are overly included sometimes in special education services when that may not be what exactly is going on. And it's just they need a job or they need to be connected to a pro-social. So I think that what we tend to be doing within the court system is trying to pile on lots of extra services, like kind of like throw everything at the problem, thinking that it's going to fix it. And I think that oftentimes that it confuses parents, it frustrates kids, it doesn't necessarily make anything better. It over pathologizes the kids by making them seem like they are less well than they are. And it's not using the kids as the resources within the community that they are.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Darrin, is there anything you want to add to that from the New Orleans context?
I think I would just really echo what Heather is saying, and just I think anecdotally what we see when we're sort of sometimes one of these programs that just gets like thrown at young people, and we have to sort of go in there and explain our sort of angle, our context, are coming from more of a youth development perspective. But oftentimes the role that we're playing is really helping parents, especially, like just navigate all these different things, because maybe this young person really does just need to be supported a little more, get connected to the right sort of like peer group or after school activities or whatever it may be. And so we're kind of coming in like, okay, who's the counselor, who's the substance abuse person, who's the restitution person, and like, let's help you figure all this out and come up with a game plan, and where it's appropriate, like advocate for, maybe this isn't the best fit. So I guess just to kind of like build on and echo what Heather is saying, I think that is a big piece of the problem, is like young people being over programmed in some respects, and people not being intimidated by attacking really the complexity of the issues that do affect young people and their families.
Yeah. I think that brings us to another question, because, New Orleans is such a special place, but I'm wondering, how do we stack up in the national conversation? So in the national context, I would love to hear from Jeff about, what does this look like on a national level about where we are?
Sure. I think it's a conversation happening in a lot of places, actually. And I've been spending a lot of my own work life lately on violence intervention. So I'm a little out of touch, but I do know from talking to colleagues, and also at the Casey Foundation, who are still working in this, that there are a number of counties like Lucas County, Ohio, Pierce County, Washington, who have really embraced these ideas. The challenge is keeping people focused on, I love the phrase you're using, like build up instead of tear down, and keeping people focused on that and not allowing these ideas to turn into yet another therapeutic intervention. But I understand the reasons for that. I understand people are under a great deal of pressure. Funding is hard to come by, support is hard to come by. So it's really tempting to walk around with the sign saying we are evidence-based, because you like that because it attracts dollars and support. But if you look at the evidence-based field, and there are very few programs that actually merit that label, it's much easier to become an evidence-based program if you're providing something in a therapeutic modality, where you one young person at a time, you have a single intervention strategy, you can randomly assign young people to get various combinations of that strategy, and then you monitor and measure their outcomes. And in our field, unfortunately, outcomes is usually, did they get rearrested? And that evidence-based literature tends to push funders to think only about either therapy or law enforcement. To do this approach, to say basically that all young people are capable of flourishing and living up to their full potential, they just need the supports that rich kids take for granted. Activities, after school stuff, vacations, arts, sports, all the things that a young person naturally responds to, is not a challenge in rich neighborhoods. So how do you take those insights and deliver them to young people who are in communities that find it difficult to provide those things? And you don't do it by what Tony Platt called child saving, like taking one young person and just pouring everything into them. You do it by building up strong communities and networks of adults who care about young people and building that neighborhood. The sports program should be the neighborhood level. The arts program should be neighborhood level. And then you make a special effort to get justice involved young people connected to those assets. The last thing I'll say is another big challenge is the way we fund these things is through reimbursement for professional services and billing. So how do you get reimbursed for something that's a program like an after school, young people learning how to do their own music mixes? That's not therapy. It's not in the list of evidence-based programs. The state doesn't recognize it as meriting reimbursement. So how do you get support for that? How do you pay for it? And that's a challenge. But most of the things that I think young people respond to and that actually help build up young people are not on the list. When the state says, what are your services? And let me see if we can pay for that. We're just not on the list. And that's a challenge. And I think we have to do, I see the world through research and evidence. So we have to do better research and evidence to get on that list. And we can talk more about that, but that's also not an easy task. And it's very frustrating that it's not happening in a lot of places right now.
Right. You've said, like 50 million things that are very, very helpful for people to understand. And one of the things that I'm seeing that is really, it really reminds me of this experience that I had when I was working at the Welcoming Project, or even when I was a teacher, and we'd say, hey, let's take the kids on a field trip. We want to take the kids somewhere, to any field trip. It didn't matter. And it was like, can you write me 3 pages about why that's important? And we don't do that other places. And so, we do have a really long way to go. And I would love to hear more, for you to tell us a little bit more about the kinds of approaches or models that we could really put in place. So even while you're talking about, all of the research and evidence we need to get into place, what are some very specific approaches and models that could really change the way the system treats kids and really focuses on their developments and strengths? And I'll kick that back to you, Jeff.
Well, again, it's basic stuff. So if your schools are a challenge, kids who are already justice involved need special help in the educational effort. But we have to do that in a way that doesn't label and stigmatize. So that's a challenge. That's within the school bureaucracy. Then you have the after school, the normal stuff, as I mentioned, music and sports and physical activity. That's also something that can be done well. And it's not, everyone knows how to do that. It's just doing it in an organized way that is supportive and for families and the young people. And I see so many things that just make me sad. Like when I moved to New York 10 years ago, I heard about the police athletic league, which I thought was fabulous. Police officers who go to a gym to play basketball with justice involved young people, and the police officers are not in uniform, they're wearing sports shirts with a little NYPD logo on it. That sounded terrific. I go to visit one in Harlem on a hot July afternoon, and the gym is empty. And what's going on? I thought this place was for basketball, summertime. And they explained to me, oh, it is, but first they have to qualify. The young people have to qualify. They have to go to these classes. They have to pass these tests. So something that sounded fabulous to me was withheld and withdrawn as punishment, rather than just being available as normal human activity. And I see this all the time. The last example I'll give you, I was visiting a residential center for justice involved young people, and they told me they had a very active music program. I was raised by 2 music teachers, so to me that seems natural, that music is a way to fire up a young person. So I said, oh, can I go see it? They take me into the gym, and these predominantly youth of color, 15, 16-year-olds are on bleachers in formation, singing what must have been like an old Pat Boone song or a Bing Crosby song or something. And I just thought, what are you doing? And I went and talked to the director, and they said, well, the music teacher's a volunteer. We really appreciate him being here. And it just showed me the disregard and the disrespect they had for young people to enforce some older person's definition of music on them. So all these things, they're not hard to do. What's hard to do is structure the organization around something that is respectful and engaging for young people. And I have seen other examples which are much more positive, but it's just easy for it to go off the rails.
Yeah, so I think that's a great segue into, talking to Darrin about what this looks like at YEP. How do we focus our approaches on youth development and respecting youth?
Sure. Yeah, and YEP does really kind of, just as Dr. Butts was talking, like, we really do exist in this space of, being one of these programs that does bill for services. We're, contracted by some, sort of justice entities to provide services to young people. But for the folks that don't know, YEP provides community-based services in 4 different buckets. So we have our workforce development, job training work, YEP Works, our high step preparation, which is YEP Educates, and then we have our YEP Enriches, which is our after-school program, summer camp and sleepaway camp. But really the sort of like the genesis of our work, really what YEP was founded to do was to provide our mentoring programs to young people involved in the justice system. And so we've had a contract directly with the Office of Juvenile Justice for 17 years we've been in existence. So it's been a very long relationship. But, I think I always tell people, there's nothing necessarily like unique or revolutionary about mentorship. Like mentorship has been around since the beginning of time, but it is about like, how do we structure, format, and really kind of like maintain an intentional focus on approaching young people as assets, full of strengths and potential, and really with the right type of like investment, and building out the kind of pathways to different opportunities, and opportunities to build skills and move on to avenues to better their lives. Excuse me. That's really, I think, where our kind of work hits the road, and really trying to focus on the strength and the power of the really positive like youth adult relationships that I think are really kind of central to all of our programs. So our youth advocates are paired with a really small caseload of young people, between 10 and 12 young folks. And the expectation is that folks are able to make contact with those young people 3 or 4 times a week. And so that contact can be with someone in their family, that can be with their probation officer to help kind of navigate some of those services. But oftentimes it's, to spend really kind of meaningful quality time directly with those young people, and have it be a really youth-directed process. And so we want to set goals that are responsive to the young people's needs and desires. And okay, so you want to get a job, we're going to help you with that. You want to get off probation, well, we're going to help you kind of strategize how to do that. But we're going to do that through building a really kind of close and caring relationship with you, and recognizing that that young people are much more than, some of the worst things they've done or whatever they did to sort of the mistake or the sort of trip up that they had to get them, involved in the justice system in the first place. So I can stop there for now.
Yeah, I mean, that's so key. Like, we're all better than the worst thing we've ever done. And so I'm going to kick it over to Heather to talk about like, what do these different approaches or models look like interpersonally, when you're working with young people and you're trying to build them up and be strengths-based?
I think the thing that I tend to think about is kids, like when a kid comes through our system and, with a car burglary, something that like we talk about a lot in New Orleans, has been a lot in the news. A lot of these kids, when we sit down to look at like what is really needed, or we do like our full biopsychosocial assessment of them, when we get into it, it's really not that there is like some particular thing that like they don't necessarily have trauma, they don't necessarily have like a mental illness, like they need a job and a basketball team, and like they would be like occupied and have a little money in their pocket then. And so I think that and the thing that is difficult in New Orleans, I think this kind of going way back to Katrina and our school system being a charter system, that like kids sometimes go to a school very far from their home. Like they don't have a community school where like when I was in high school, after school programs were done at your school. And then, you can walk home afterwards or take a bus home afterwards. And I know it's like a really big deal in these schools, like, oh, do they have the money for a bus, like an activities bus home at the end of it? And so like kids can't participate in these things. And I think like those are the types of things that we are always trying to troubleshoot. Like we always want mentoring. We always want to have like more sports and arts programs. But I just think like it's really hard for us to access for those reasons. And I think that like that, if we're thinking about like how to solve this as a problem, I think like that's what we need to be thinking through, because there's like great programs that tend to be like in certain areas if you can get to them, but like if you can't get to them, and sometimes, you know, the East is very far from Carrollton, how do we get those kids involved with something too? And how do we get like programs so that like all kids have things that they can do kind of as a baseline? I think that that would be the thing that would go the furthest for, I'm not sure if that answered your question, Sarah, but that's like,
I mean, I think it got to some of the things. I think, you know, if you wanted to add a little bit more to share, you know, kind of a story about when things, you know, kind of turned around for a young person because you built, you know, a lot of what Darrin was saying, that relationship with a young person that can move. But we're going to get to also the meat of what you just said a little bit more in the next, in our next section. But if you want to kind of add that piece of, yeah, what does it look like for us, you know, when this happens interpersonally?
it always is sad to me when we go and sit down with a kid and like talk to them and tell them like, you know, that we're working with them and that they're on, like we're on their side and we're trying to figure this out. And that they feel like they have someone that they can really talk to and really trust, versus someone who is going to be like another person that they just say, like we have kids that'll start out like, yes, ma'am, yes, ma'am, yes, ma'am, yes, ma'am. And have to be like, you don't have to do that. Like, I appreciate that you're trying to be so polite, but like, I don't even know that you're hearing the things that I'm saying. Like, let's have a real conversation about what's going on. And I think if you can break through that thing where they feel like they can actually like talk back, and like it's okay to have a differing opinion from an adult or something like that, and that like we're still going to listen to them and we're still going to work with them, I think that's when we tend to see things like become more collaborative, and it became like, I want to listen, like what do you want to have happen? What do you think would be the best thing in this situation? Like, you're an expert in your own life. I'm like, I don't know what's going on in your family. And I think like those are the types of things, and that's the type of language that kids really seem to respond to, and that like can help really build that close client relationship that we have, and that is central to the work that we're doing.
Yeah, and yeah, thank you for that. I think all of you have talked about what is basically a confluence of systemic barriers on a lot of things. So, you know, we were talking about, you know, Hurricane Katrina. We're talking about getting in the way of, you know, social, having these ideas about what should be funded, getting in the way of what work actually really needs to be done, and having, you know, also the trauma of the system impact young people in this way where they're like, yes, I understand. Sure. Okay. Whatever you want. And I really remember this from my most recent like direct service work, was working at the Welcoming Project. And you're trying to build this system that really responds to strengths and interests and music and is art focused for formerly incarcerated young people. And there are a lot of barriers to that. And I think young people are like, I don't know what I want to do at this point. Like, whatever will make you happy. I'm like, what will make you happy? And that was like, oh, okay. I guess we could sit and talk about that and figure it out after a while. And I think there were also all of these barriers that Jeff brought up too, and kind of talked about, you know, funding and the carceral system and all of these things. And so let's talk about barriers. Let's be really honest about barriers, especially in New Orleans. And I know we have a lot of different people on this call, some who are policymakers, some who work in the space, and some who have really great contacts. So let's start with Darrin. Can you start, Darrin, and then Heather, you know, jump in. What are the barriers to these models? Let's be really honest about those.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we kind of touched on it here and there, but, you know, when the system, whichever, you know, we're talking about educational system, justice system, you know, housing, economics, whatever, you know, really like applies this like one size fits all approach to young people, I think can just be a big barrier, really damaging, and really kind of totally miss the mark on what young people are truly in need of. And so when that does happen, right, like when there's a set of program services that are, okay, everybody gets this, and just I hope you make it out all right. When those systems miss the mark, and young people do maybe get in trouble or are not able to sort of like navigate their way out of some of these situations, the readiness to blame young people for all those failures and not sort of like put that accountability back on all of us as adults, back onto the systems for not, sort of identifying and then sort of working intentionally to address the unique and individual needs that young people have. I think that can be one of the biggest barriers. Again, I think where we sort of come in is try to infuse some of that individuality into the service delivery to young people. But I think that's sort of the first thing that kind of comes to mind. And the second thing, or where I'll sort of stop and hand it over to Heather, is I think like also just the like honest recognition that like so many young people are struggling with just like very essential and basic economic needs. And that is like just like at the core, so in addition to, I think, just the sort of race and racism that exists like in our culture as Americans. But I would say like the sort of like very basic economic needs of children and families, I think is another huge, I think like not often recognized barrier to young people's success.
Yeah, Heather, why don't you take it from there?
I think that the barriers are for us, there's just not enough programs. Like we need more places, we need more things where we can like help connect kids to, or preferably that their school can connect them to so they don't come into the justice system in the first place. Like if kids are like connected at the school level, I think like they may never even get to us. I think it like works really good as a preventative also. But I think like secondarily of like having more programs is that like they need to be geographically kind of strategically placed where like all kids can access them. Like I touched on this a little bit before, but it's always an issue of trying, I mean, like we're constantly trying to troubleshoot this idea of transportation. And, we don't live in New York City where everyone can just like hop on a subway and get somewhere easily. It's like really difficult for people to take public transportation to get places, and it takes a really long time. And so I think thinking about like that these programs just can't be in a couple places, even if they're central, it still makes it really difficult. And I think the other thing that what Darrin just said that really touched a nerve with me and that I would totally agree with is just, I think the adults being self-reflective about this idea that like adults and not children are responsible for the positive youth development of children. That like if there's something going wrong, that is on us. Like we are doing something wrong, not the children. And then like for us to be figuring out what those solutions to it are.
Yeah, that's so right. Also the transportation thing, I just feel like every service provider and every person who works with young people are like always carting a bunch of young people around in this city at least. And I just feel like that cannot continue. Like we have to really invest in public transportation that is free for young people. And that would be great. So Jeff, can you talk to us about, so we need more programs, but what are some of the pitfalls of very well-intentioned programs? So what are some of the things to watch out for?
Well, I do think about evidence, of course, research evidence, and the currency of programming and funding and support and labor costs and salaries, it's become about the question, does it work? Is it effective? And I want to tell you that the research field is letting down this community and the community of justice involved young people, certainly, but the community of well-intentioned, capable adults and community members who were willing to do this. And the one thing I want to explain, you probably all know this, but if you're talking to an academic, they're always thinking about themselves. They're always thinking about, where can I publish this article? Is it prestigious enough? Am I going to win the award? Am I going to get promoted? I would say in any community, if you're trying to build these kind of efforts, you need to have a partner who has the skills of a good researcher. And it's also hard sometimes to tell the difference between a researcher and an advocate. Real researchers find the word advocacy to be a little unseemly, because it means I have my point of view and I'm going to try to convince you and I'm going to show you a data graph. It's not the good data graph. It's not really pertinent, but it looks nice and you might buy it. That's advocacy. A researcher is trying to carefully build evidence that will stand up to scrutiny of the most ill-intended people. To do that, you need someone who has the ability to structure a research project in a way. It cannot be global. It can't be, does YEP work? It has to be, does this component work? Does having young people go immediately from school to the sports program and stay at least 60 minutes, at least 3 days a week, and participate, do they have different outcomes 6 months later than a group who only went after school and hung out and wasn't in a structured effort? Does that structure make a difference? You have to ask very precise questions with a good research design that will generate the evidence that a city council person or a county commissioner or a state legislator will listen to. Because if you don't have that evidence, you will have friends who believe these things and are willing to support you. But you've got to turn the doubters into people who are willing to listen to this. And then, of course, it's easy to say, hey, this is a lot cheaper than what you're doing. Let us do this. We just need the support to do this. And here's the evidence that it actually makes a difference. Right now, the whole research field is running around testing mentoring and testing cognitive behavioral therapy. And the research field is not building the structure to build up instead of tearing down. And so I take this on as my sort of my own, maybe it's a windmill I tend to tilt at, but you need to find a locally based researcher who can work with your program to develop this approach. Someone who probably has already gotten promoted and isn't worried about their promotion, wants to do something meaningful, and get them connected to you and work with them as a partner.
Yeah. So I want to let folks know that at 5:40, like in about 5 minutes, you can ask questions. We'll open up for questions and everything like that. I want to get us to, kind of our last, sort of closing section. Let's call it a closing section of thoughts, but we'll also have time to dig in with questions from other people. And I kind of want to make a little bit of a change because I kind of want to ask this question about what would it look like, yes, let's think about how do we get to where we want to be? How do we build up youth? How do we change from this tearing down modality that we have? But I also want us to think about this question of what if we move all of our money, all of our funding, all of our effort to things that are, positive youth development that happen way before kids ever got in trouble or thought about getting in trouble or had that situation in which they were and I had a young person I worked with like this, who basically went from, playing basketball to, breaking into cars because he couldn't be in the basketball team anymore because he had gotten system involved and they didn't want him on the basketball team. So what if we just shifted everything further upstream? And so I kind of want us to close on that idea. How do we get to where we need to go with this building up youth and thinking about just let's dream big? And so I'll start with Heather and then we'll go to Jeff and then we'll go to Darrin.
I think that it's really pretty easy. You go over to Newman or Holy Cross or one of the fancy, expensive schools, Country Day, and find out what they have and then do those things. It's we want the same thing for the kids that we're working with that kids that have means have. It's think about what do you want for your own kids? That's all that we're asking for these kids. What are the things that you had to do to get into college or like look good on a college thing. Like those things that are good about like being in a club or being in sports or like having like some kind of like thing that you were into. Like it's just having those things offered as opportunities like in every neighborhood in the city. I think like that's the thing that would do it.
Jeff?
Yeah, but the trick is if you open up the funnel too big, it dilutes the dose, dilutes the effect as well. So I understand the metaphor of just doing basic things that all young people need and want, but you also still have to have some kind of way of focusing your resources on the young people who clearly are like headed in a direction that we worry about them. So there still has to be, without stigmatizing and without sort of criminal justice thinking, there still needs to be some way of focusing our efforts on the young people that need us the most, that don't have the assets in their own home and their own community. So I'm not sure how basic and wide you can become because you risk losing the focus.
All right, Darrin, take us home.
I'm gonna try. I guess the first thing I think that immediately hit me, and this is maybe a combination of the two previous ideas, is like, I do really think it, like we will need to at least have at least two-pronged approach, maybe more than two prongs, but like for sure, like I think expanding access to all of the wonderful, sort of developmentally appropriate opportunities that young people should have access to, just to, to increase the equity in those spaces would be wonderful and needed. But also, I think, young people are going to do the things young people do, right? And make mistakes and do kind of stupid stuff and end up in trouble. And so those young people aren't lost, they're not broken, they're not, unable to be redeemed, right? And so those young people need that sort of intervention point a little further down the stream also. And so I think, again, I think this is one of the things personally I really enjoy about the work that we do at YEP. Our program has like most definitely grown in ways that is like much more preventative, much more community-based, sort of like trying to intervene further upstream. But I think it's been a really intentional decision to maintain our really close partnership with the Office of Juvenile Justice, because we know young people that are returning from juvenile life need supports and services when they're returning home, right? Young people that are on 5 years of probation need some support and some services. And so they've, have they missed their opportunity to sort of get back on the right track? Like, I don't think so. So, having access at multiple points along that continuum is, I think, something that if we had an unlimited amount of money, something that we should invest in.
Awesome. So I really want to thank our panelists. I want to tell folks, please put more questions in the chat. I have one for starting that someone asked a little bit ago. So we'll start with that one. But I do think that this is just one of those discussions that has to keep being had. And so I'm really thankful that we were, all of our panelists had so much to add to this, and there are just so many, it's complicated, but necessary. So, all right. The first question that I got a little while ago was about our charter school system. Since New Orleans is 100% charter school system, how do we get each CMO to buy in, so charter management organization, to buy in to prevent barriers for our young people? Anyone can take that.
I don't know the answer to that question. I know that when I worked in a school, that like one of the largest line items in the budget had to do with transportation. And that was because like they were taking kids all the way from one end of the city to the other. And that, it was a big lift to get them to even agree to like add another bus at the end of the day so the basketball team could get home or whatever. So I think that it's something that we need to try to figure out, like how to incentivize to them, to have that be as like part of what's considered successful for a school or something. But I also think that like we can hopefully we can start thinking about like having our schools be more community based at some point in the future. I mean, that's the hope. That's what I think like people were saying, like after a certain amount of years when all the schools are great, people will just want to go to the school in their neighborhood. And I feel like I don't know how many years that's going to take, but like that would kind of solve a lot of these like front end preventative, just like regular interventions that all kids could be getting if they could just do it at their school, or to have like charters want to like invest in transportation as part of what they are expected to provide.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I don't know if other folks remember this, but when I was growing up here, I went to car, and I actually I went to Edna Car for middle school, and I rode the public bus, the public transportation to school, and I had tokens, and there was just that was just the thing, and everybody got their tokens at the beginning of the week, and you got on the bus with them. And I don't remember when that stopped, and I don't remember when we started being like, oh, transportation is this insurmountable thing, even though we have like something called Regional Transportation Authority. And so there are all of these, ways I keep thinking about that. Like we seem to have created more problems somehow. Darrin or Jeff, do you want to answer that question at all?
I guess, I think to just add on to what Heather's saying, like a lot of this, I think, comes down to people have like some fixed resources. And so some of it is like definitely, having conversation with schools, advocating to schools, like where they do have discretionary resources to, to be investing those things in the right places, or to support their most vulnerable students and things like that. But some of it, and I know some of the partnerships we've had directly with charter management organizations in the past, is like, that there's at least some initial kind of like investment or seed funding or something to sort of get an idea off the ground to really, sort of test the effectiveness of it, or sort of work out some of those kinks, is where I think we have been successful in partnerships with the schools to, again, support some of the most vulnerable young people that they serve. But, and again, it's like, how deep do you want to go? Because it's like, how is the sort of charter management kind of performance structure in the state set up to incentivize schools to focus on these things and not these things? So, I think it's a very nuanced and complicated challenge.
Yeah. And I see, so in the chat, I love how pop in the chat is. I do want to say some of you have created some paragraphs in here, and I don't read them fast. So I'll point, to, there's a study about, supporting social emotional learning and sports-based youth development. I'll also point to, there was sort of a question, and maybe Darrin can hit it like in the next conversations about walking people through a real life example of a YEP, a young person from YEP who was able to, get their things on the right track, and where their parents were in that process. And then there is a long question that I am gonna figure out, which is, give me one moment, folks. I have to find, also, I can now tell this person is a lawyer, and they're about as long-winded as me. So maybe Joseph Schneiderman.
Yeah. Hi, yes.
Thank you.
If you'd like me to pose my question orally, I'm happy to do so.
Yes, could you just ask the question? That would be wonderful.
Sure. Now, or I don't want to take anyone's time.
Oh, right now. Right now would be good.
Okay.
Yeah.
How does this play out on the day-to-day one-on-one level? Like, as my question puts it, I'm an appellate lawyer. I'm, for any of our baseball fans who are there, I'm either Darryl Strawberry coming off the bench to potentially swing for the fences, or I'm Mariano Rivera coming out of the bullpen to either strike out the side or to stop or to put a stop to a bad bases loaded situation. How does this play out concretely if we want to be focusing on the good of a young person? should the starting point be, before I get into any of the hard law stuff, which I can quote 7 ways from Sunday, tell me about you and what you like, and know that I'm here for you no matter what? How does that, is that the more concrete day-to-day one-on-one approach we should be taking? Because believe me, I get it. The systemic problems are there, but you can't always, in my position, you can't always go after the systemic problems. You can only go after justice for one client at a time.
Yeah. And that's actually a great question for social workers, because yeah, it's perfect. It's a different lens, and it's a different spot. So thank you for that question, Joseph. And I'll kick it over to Darrin. Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I could at least start. That's because that really is the heart of it, for sure. Especially like in the role of a lawyer, legal professional, like that's what you're there to do, right? To do the law stuff. And so, I mean, I guess the first few things that like come to mind immediately is, I think, one, just to like be like authentic in your sort of engagement and relationship with young people. And so if some of that is explaining some of the law to them, but I think also just like the consistency, following through on the things that you're saying you're going to do, and also just like taking every opportunity, I think, to communicate to young people that you care for them and you sort of like see them and value them as a person. And maybe that's a little kind of like, fluffy and all that kind of stuff. But, I think you do that with your words and your actions. Yeah, I think the thing I always tell my staff is like the biggest thing we can do is like be consistent for young people. Because similar to what we talked about earlier in the panel, it's like a lot of these like systemic failures where people do really interact with the systems in a negative way is like they're being let down by the system over and over and over again. Like somebody told me this thing and then that thing didn't happen, or I was thinking it was going to be this way and it was totally not that way. So I think like just to be like kind of really honest, transparent, and authentic with young people, and maintain the level of consistency that is possible, would be like my very kind of like off the top of my head recommendations.
That's helpful. Heather or Jeff?
I'll jump in. One of the major problems with this whole endeavor is that it's designed and managed by human beings. And if you know the phrase that most of us we think about the solutions that we have to offer, and then we go in search of a problem that they might fit. And I've just seen that too much and the best example in my own career is juvenile drug courts. As soon as people started doing juvenile drug courts, they just started using it for everything. And I remember being in a courtroom once, and there was a kid who'd been arrested for selling, and all the clinicians said he didn't have a drug problem, and he's in juvenile drug court, which was all about dependency and addiction. And I thought, and the judge told me, well, but it's a good program and we think it might help. And that happens way too much, that we have a few things we do, and then we try to shoehorn every problem into those few things. Mm-hmm. Instead, doing what YEP does, or any good program does, which is get to know the young person first. What do you love? What do you like? How do you spend your time? What's important to you? What don't you have? Let's talk to me about what, and then figuring out what the approach is based upon that person in their real life. Most bureaucrats don't have time to do that, and they only have 1, 2, or 3 options, and they just force everyone into those 1, 2, or 3 options. So somehow you have to get past that.
Yeah, Heather.
Yeah, I always think about like the kid that you go to visit in jail, and like they're cold and they're hungry, and you're trying to figure, and like I think it's like you got this big thing to do, you want to ask all these questions, but like you really need to like stop and take a step back and be like, okay, can I get you something? Can I advocate can I like show you that I'm going to stand up for you to someone else, like, and say like, hey, do you think you could get him a blanket, or can you get him he never got a toothbrush, can you make sure that he gets that? And I think like those like tiny little things go a really long way before you even start getting into questions with kids, to showing them that like that you're willing to do something like for them, that I think is really important. But I think the thing I would definitely say, like all of the things that Darrin and Jeff said are like being authentic and following through on your promises, and like caring about what they care about in a way that like feels authentic. And just like asking kids about their lives. They just like, they want to talk about music, or they want to talk about the song that they're really into right now, and like I might not know anything about that, but they can tell me about that. And so like they can take that moment to be an expert on that thing. And I think that's how you really go, like making that relationship, like finding like all the good things about that kid and using that as a starting point.
Yeah, that's great. That's how I learned about NBA Youngboy. So, I'm sure Heather and Darrin know all about that. So again, thank you so much. I'm going to turn things over to Aaron to close us out. I'm done. Thank you for all of this.
Yeah, and thank you, Sarah. I want to just thank all the panelists for leading us in this discussion. We've designed this as to be a jumping off point, not comprehensive discussion about these issues. But I think what's so different about this is, notice we didn't talk about monitoring children. We didn't talk about surveilling them or providing consequences. We started by talking about creating a supportive environment that then we can build from, and within that build things like accountability and maybe interventions or suggest changes. Really, if you enjoy these discussions, we do need support to keep them going. If you're willing to throw in $10 or something along those lines, please do. But also there's opportunities to act, because while we're here doing this, and a lot of times people say, okay, but I support these types of programs, but we just don't have them, and we got to do something now, and there's kids who are misbehaving. Well, let's look at what our city leaders are doing right now. They aren't having this discussion. Tomorrow morning, they are looking to expand our curfew laws so that they can further surveil and stop children on the streets. And what we know is that this will be our Black children that will be stopped at a much higher rate. And so what you can do today is contact your city council members, because they not only want to pass this, they want to pass this as part of the consent agenda, meaning with very little public comment or debate. And so I really would urge you, if this is the conversation you want to have, then we need to start having it now. And there's a city council meeting tomorrow. And instead of this, they're talking about failed policies that won't make us safer. So I just want to put that out there, that we're here to raise awareness, but also to spur some action. And so if you'll join us in that, we want to work with you. We want to thank you for taking all your time tonight. If you want to continue the conversation, feel free to be in touch with us. Otherwise, everyone, please have a lovely evening. Take care.